Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. If you've checked out the title, you'll see that we've got a guest today, and we'll get to them very shortly. But before we get to that, Magical Learning is a training and facilitation company that's been running for over 25 years and has partnered with global thought leaders like John Mattone and Robin Sharma. Today, we are bringing some learnings from other experts, and our expert today is Chris Power. But before we get into a little bit about them, Chris, what's going on this week? How are you going?
I'm having a great week. It's only Wednesday, I think. So a bit of physical activity, bit of work stuff, lots of writing. I'm on a bit of a media tour at the moment. So podcasts, writing more articles, and lots of coaching too already this week.
Wow, got a lot going on there, Chris. Well, that's very exciting, and I think that tees us up very nicely for a conversation we're going to be talking to you about today, which is Inflection Leadership, which is a white paper you've written recently. But you are Chris Power of Power Projects. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself for listeners that may be being introduced to you for the first time?
Thank you. Yes, I'm an organisation consultant, leadership coach and advisor working across all sectors with senior leaders and their teams. I've had my business for 27 years, so feeling a little bit old, but it's kind of my claim to fame as well, that I've been doing this work for a really long time. And in different guises, but yeah, I've had Power Projects going for 27 years, so LinkedIn tells me.
Well, I mean, we can't think of someone better to have on today. And look, you sent through a little sort of headline here, and I think it's one of the most eye-catching I've seen in a while, which is AI geopolitics uncertainty, why inflection leadership is becoming essential. Now, you've got this concept of inflection leadership that you've written a white paper about. And I think Danette's question actually teases us up really nicely for this. So I'll get you to talk about why you wrote it, but let's start with Danette's first question here as well, which is, can you explain what inflection leadership is?
So if I go back to, what is an inflection point? You're probably hearing that language at the moment a little bit more than even just a year ago. So inflection point, the definition is it's a moment when significant change occurs or may occur, and it's a turning point. And they can be external. So right now we are in, I would actually say, one of or many of the biggest inflection points of our time, geopolitically, technologically with AI, demographically, we have an aging population, socioeconomically, even locally with politics, with elections coming, policy shifts. These are moments that have an impact on us just as individuals, as people, and certainly on businesses and organisations. And they require of us to do something different. Those inflections, that I just talked about can be external, but they can also be internally driven. If we've in an organisation, we've just sold a big contract or multiple contracts, and suddenly how we do business has to shift because actually we need a greater workforce, or it just looks a bit different. Those businesses that are making acquisitions, suddenly that is a difference in who they are and how they go to market and how they're organised. It's a major turning point for businesses, and it requires, to your point about, therefore, inflection leadership, it requires a different kind of leadership. And that's my premise.
Yeah, I love that. And I was just going to say, Chris, let's kind of stay there a little bit because we've just had two bits of information that I think fit really nicely together, which is one, you've been doing power projects for a long time. So you've seen different inflection points in the past.
Yes.
And now we're seeing this sort of new amount of inflection points, it seems like, sort of simultaneously. And you're sort of discussing inflection leadership, what that might look like. Do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of how inflection points might have looked in the past and, what inflection leadership kind of looks like?
Well, possibly the biggest and the most recognizable, outside of recessions and the global financial crisis, would have to be COVID and the lockdowns. I mean, that was perhaps, I think, actually the biggest inflection point any of us have ever experienced. And it prompted us to do things really differently. The lockdowns, and if you think about the fact that we're talking here, I'm in my office, you're in yours, who would have thought, at the beginning of 2020 that we would be doing this, that we would run a business. In fact, most often had a business that I've worked from home, and I used to almost have to pretend that I didn't. I say, "Oh, the office dog," that's going into my office at home. So, but that whole working from home, how we're structured, that was a massive shift. It could never have been done in any other way, it would seem, that the city would suddenly be empty on a Monday and a Friday, um, you know, and everything else that goes with that. And we saw a really different response from a lot of businesses in that time as well. There were those that hunkered down and said, this too shall pass. Um, and, took their job keeper and just fingers crossed, still had a business at the end of it. Um, there were those who said, right, well, what else can I do? Gin companies making hand sanitizer. Um, you know, other people going, there's a hole in the market. There's something that I could offer. There's something new. There's an opportunity. Because that's actually a thing that I want to say right at the outset is that inflection points do require a different kind of leadership. But let's not assume that inflection points are all negative. There's great opportunity if you know where to look. And I think that's the real skill in all of this. We can get really frightened by change and go, oh, this is all terrible. Actually, there's enormous potential.
Yeah, wow. So, Chris, I've got so many thoughts just off that quickly. First thing is, just you talking about how much COVID's affected things, and just even a subtle thing is, for those watching along at on YouTube or Spotify, I've set up my own background, and that is the direct result of this type of conversation that we're having. So, like, the way that my room is actually set up is a direct result of the video podcasting that we're now doing,
Yeah,
which is a direct result of sort of COVID as a broader thing that increases technology. So, even like house design is subtly changed so that, it presents differently on screen, which is a kind of fascinating, weird sort of, I guess, sort of thing that's a bit inflected upon. But the second thing that I was going to say is it's so fascinating you're talking about gin companies and hand sanitizer because, you think like, who was even buying hand sanitizer necessarily prior to COVID, and then how much people needed it. And you go, gin companies could have made any sort of alcoholic product, alcohol swabs. They could have done a lot of different things, but to go, this is actually an emerging market that we can now capitalize on is really fascinating.
absolutely. And you couldn't get it. Remember, there was a shortage. So, they were crazy times. I don't want to take people back there. It probably, it wasn't necessarily a great experience for everyone, but
Yeah.
it was a big inflection point.
It was. And look, we've all made it through. If we're listening to this podcast, we're all on the other side of it mostly. So good work. Let's jump into another inflection point, though, because we do hear a lot about this. This actually comes up quite a lot on Magical Learning Podcast, which is about AI. And so Graham's written this question in, which is, in a world where we're being offered AI more and more, is there a positive inflection point to not adapting to AI use?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. I think that it is about choice, and it's always about choice. Um, my thought about this is that AI is not going away. So, you know what I said before about, hunkering down and this too shall pass? What concerns me about that is that people might miss the opportunity to get on board and to experiment and explore and be curious. I heard someone say recently, just sit with it and notice it and be curious about what AI could possibly give you and where the risks are. So you may choose to not adopt it, but I would say don't do that out of fear or uncertainty, because the whole point around inflections is that it is often based on uncertainty and people's desire to have certainty and to reduce risk. And that might be the very thing that actually we need right now to embrace, is a different way of being with it.
I love that. And there's something that's really sort of sticking out to me, which is the concept of a choice. Like, because when you're talking about inflection points, and people can naturally almost feel anxious about them,
Totally.
because it's a change, and so obviously change has an uncertain outcome. But it seems like you have a very positive approach. Like you've at least worked out a way to view change in a very positive way, or at least a way that can be positive. Do you want to talk a little bit about how choice is something that you're sort of looking at through this lens?
I think um, it it is always about choice. You know, do I go this way? Do I go that way? What is critical to making a choice? Information. And absolutely agency. You know, some people listening to this might say, "Oh, well, happy days. I don't have a lot of choice in whether I do this work or how I show up." So I do recognize that. What I can choose is the energy that I bring to it, um, the assumptions that drive me, my mindset, what I choose to give my attention to. There is choice. And what is important for me around that is that we're not on autopilot with any of this. Change, um, we can, change comes, we can have change do to us, we're done to by change, or we can say, how do I engage with it and try and influence it? And what bits can I influence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's great. And just that concept of autopilot actually is something that I've been talking to people about recently in terms
Mm.
of just internet usage in general, and the difference between choosing what you're looking at versus being chosen for, in some ways. Yeah, you're
Algor-
nodding your head there.
Algorithms, oh my goodness, and I can scroll with the best of them. So, I said to someone the other day, "Oh, look, I don't have TikTok." She said, "Oh," we were complaining, "Oh, LinkedIn's starting to look a bit like TikTok." And I said, "It's what I imagine TikTok is because I've never been on it and I can't be led on it. No good will come from that."
Well, I think that's a good solid boundary you've set for yourself there, Chris, around your energy, which I love. Let's continue on because we're talking about sort of more inflections, and we love Mug. Has a couple kids, and she likes to usually write in from a family perspective. So I'm going to go to her question here, which is, what tips would you have to help kids prepare for a world of more inflections?
Oh, get comfortable with uncertainty. We talked already about it a little so far. Uncertainty is not going to go away. So, absolutely, children like boundaries and they need to know, hey, I go to bed at this time, or our family looks like this, or these are the things we do on Saturdays, and these are the spontaneous things that might also occur. So we know that kids do like certainty, but it's also introducing the concept, I think, of we don't always know what's happening, and that's okay. And we can sit with discomfort. I've been writing about that quite a bit lately, about, you know, what what causes us to feel discomfort, and possibly maybe it's okay because not everything is comfortable.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's really interesting. Because you're right. It's such a discomfort and uncertainty. These are words we hear a little bit about, but you've been reflecting on them. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts, because this is really interesting.
Yeah, well, I've just been writing an article this morning about it, the changing role of leaders with inflection leadership. Um, and for many leaders who are used to controlling everything and setting a strategy and knowing that a strategy, we can just execute on the strategy because it's not exactly set and forget, but we know everything is stable. Right now, almost nothing is stable, really. I mean, different sectors, different businesses will have a different level of stability, but there's a lot of change going on. So for some leaders, that is uncomfortable to say what is required of me now, which is the first premise of inflection leadership, is to pause and ask not what is my personal preference, but what is required of me in this role of leader right now in this context. There is discomfort when what I thought my role of leader was is no longer. So to have all the answers, to provide certainty to everybody, to know that this is the strategy and this is the way forward. To say, well, we said we were doing this, so we are. Well, actually, what if you didn't have all the answers? And what if actually what you need to now lead with is a whole lot of information that you can't even have yourself? So you've got to surround yourself with people who do have information and bring the right people in the room. So it's not you as the leader having all of the answers. For a lot of leaders, that would really cause them some discomfort. So that changing nature of the leadership role is what I'm talking about when I talk about discomfort.
It's making me feel like some people, this will be the opposite of what they did before, because you're talking about control, and that maybe if you're in a leadership position, you may have got there through control. You may have been like, I'm good at setting exactly what you're saying, frameworks, strategies that are built in a world that is somewhat consistent, so the results are at least somewhat predictable. But now what you're saying is it's much more, not responsive is the wrong word, but it's like you're taking information in before you're making decisions in a way that may not have been happening so quickly and so often in the past. And so if you're someone who loves control, this, I'm sure, must be a really a bit of a hurricane of change.
Absolutely. And some leaders have gone into the role, as you said, because they're good at the strategy or they've been really great in the technical aspect of the role, of that function that they have. And now what we're saying, for example, we've talked about AI. If you're implementing AI, what we know is that already the return on investments that some, organizations thought they were going to get, they're not getting them right now. Why aren't they? Because they haven't taken care of the people aspect of it. They're pulling cost out without thinking about, okay, we've got agentic AI. Who's sitting beside the AI, AI agent? How does that person operate? How does this all work? What are the human skills that we actually need? And leaders right now are needing to dial up their coaching, their ability to align their teams around what's required and how they want to work together. They're having those kinds of conversations. Now, it's not that leaders weren't doing that before. Of course they were, but it's dialed up. It's really, really critical. Particularly, we've been talking about uncertainty. I can't tell you exactly it's for certain the future looks like this. But I can tell you about how your leaders are working together and how, we will, make the way forward. That's a really different skill for a leader who's relied on their technical ability.
Wow. Well, look, I want to keep going down these rabbit holes, but we've got other questions to
You're right.
get to. So, no, this is good. This is really good. It's so fascinating. I like to sort of do some thinking about thinking sometimes with my questions.
Mhm.
So my question was a little bit about what inflection led you to the realization about this concept of sort of inflection leadership and inflection points, because, like you said, you've been in business a long time, so you've
Hmm.
I've seen a few of them. I was just fascinating. What sparked your sort of
What was my
thoughts on this
inflection?
concept? Yeah.
I've been thinking about this too. It probably comes with um, like an internal and a personal inflection of just saying, what do I want to do next? Who am I? And I've had this business for a long time. Um, my kids have grown. Um, I want to see what I can do with this business. And I got myself a business coach and mentor. And um, in working with my coach, I had to really think about, well, what is my IP? What is, do I even have any? I said, oh, I just do good work. Okay, well, what is it that I actually do? How do I really help teams? I didn't just leave my HR job the other day and hang out my shingle. I've been doing this for a long time. And so it was actually going through that process of thinking about who do I work with? What is it that I help them with? That combined with just following geopolitics and also working with clients in technology, noticing what was happening with AI sort of bubbling around the edges. And I realized that it is at this moment of inflection is where I do my best work. And so that it sort of all came together. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to put it on paper. And I put it on paper in my white paper towards the end of last year. And even then, the language of inflection points wasn't really landing. I had one client that I did an inflection navigator masterclass. And they used to just call it, oh yeah, the resilience masterclass. I went, no, it's not about resilience. It's about navigating this major inflection points. Now it has totally shifted in this 6 months. Yeah, so it's an iterative thing, and it's gonna keep evolving, and that is the nature of inflection points.
And I think it's interesting, like the difference between resilience and inflection points seem, at least through this conversation, obvious to me in the sense that tell me if I'm wrong in this, but my understanding is that resilience is like both are an oncoming change. Resilience is kind of an ability to, in my mind, almost hunker down and survive it. Whereas what you're talking about with a inflection point is like actually this is like a sort of fork in the road that gives you an opportunity to pick a side, and you can actually just like head forward as opposed to almost hunkering down. It's like a positive decision as opposed to a sort of neutral decision. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, it's not about riding something out and surviving.
Mm.
I actually think it's about thriving. It's how, how am I as an individual, and how am I as a leader leading teams to thrive in these times of inflection, because they are challenging. So we want people to thrive, rather than just survive. Now that might be ambitious and optimistic, but I am both. So
I think you're also kind of I think you're also kind of pointing to the idea though that uncertainty is becoming the certainty. So it's kind of in some ways, like you got to kind of, if you like certainty, then you should like uncertainty in a weird paradoxical way at the moment.
yeah, okay. Okay, that is a weird paradox, but yes.
Well, speaking of uncertainty, let's go to Allegra's question here. And she's written in, do you find certain people are better at handling uncertainty than others? How would someone with a low threshold for uncertainty go with embracing inflections?
Absolutely, it is all uncertainty is the key, and I think maybe it's top of mind for us all right now, because there is so much uncertainty, in where we're at. People with a low threshold, what is it that they need? They want to feel in control. They want to know that everything is as I believe it should be. For me to be okay, then these are the conditions that need to exist. That is difficult. So the first thing that I would do is to think about, Stephen Covey's circle of influence, circle of control. When there is when there is seemingly no control, what do I have control over? Well, actually, my own response, how I show up, how I engage. The people who are going, "Oh my goodness, AI, don't want a bar of it." No, not interested. Okay, it's a choice. And so you can choose to do that, or you can choose, as we talked about before, perhaps a different way of responding, of simply being curious. I'm just saying, I'll watch it. I don't have to reject it. But either way, it's my response that I have control over, especially if I'm working in an organisation and I feel I don't have control over anything much else that's happening.
Well, and can I say, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I noticed something very interesting when you were answering that question, which is, tell me if I'm wrong. It's like your brain went into a diagnosis mode, which was really interesting because you went,
Feel my face.
yeah, no, just because of how you were thinking out loud was really interesting because you went, if someone has a low threshold for uncertainty, that means they have a need for control. Like to you, being able to, it's like it's like it was you're looking at a symptom that gives you sort of a cleaner
No.
look into something like exactly. So sorry, I don't know if I was wrong in thinking that, but it was just very interesting to see that you were able to look at that almost as a diagnostic, like as a diagnosis for something else that you can sort of interact with in a different way.
Well, I'm trying to think about what brings a person to this point. What are the assumptions that are running them? And that's the work that I do with leaders is, we all, when things get tricky, where do I go to feel safe? And I might go into needing things to be perfect. Or what keeps me safe? Being autocratic, being the boss, my way or the highway. What keeps me safe might be I'll just go along to get along. I'll just fit in. Nothing to see here. This stuff is all based on childhood, how we grew up, what our families look like, what school, work, uni, all of this stuff. We didn't just arrive today going, ta-da, here I am as a leader. We've been working on ourselves for years. And we have habits and patterns of behaving and thinking um, that guide us, and some trip us up because our desire for safety kicks in when things feel uncertain or unsafe. We go to a place that may have served us well at once, but maybe it doesn't now, particularly if I'm leading a team.
Yeah,
Yeah,
wow, that's a really big one. Where do I go to feel safe is really going to be a takeaway because to me that's so much more than business. That explains so much
Oh,
behavior that you see in the world.
it's completely what's happening. The binary thinking that's going on right now. If you're not for me, you must be against me. Um, that's people retreating to safety. What keeps me safe?
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Like we had a podcast a couple of weeks ago. Where we were talking just about this, just to stay on this topic for one second. We were talking about um, binary thinking is good in a short term. Like if you needed to make a decision in 1 minute, it's better just make a decision and then go with it. But as you
Mhm.
start to stretch out that time frame, binary thinking becomes less useful because you give yourself more opportunity to add nuance, better understanding, and give yourself a better opportunity for a better answer.
Yeah.
But when I guess what you're saying, tell me if I'm sort of like using this thinking the right way
Oh,
is if someone is having a lot of binary thinking, then that's telling us that either their brain's trapped in a short-term thinking pattern, which I guess could be sort of a survival pattern if like they're kind of stuck in the short term, or they're sort of again struggling maybe and it's forcing them into that sort of closed off decision making, like I've got to make a decision one way or the other.
yeah. It could be. It could be. I feel unsafe, therefore I better go to this point. It could also just be really old habits of being, old way of existing in the world. Um, and either they haven't done the work, they haven't had the feedback that suggests, this is not as useful as you might think it is.
Yeah, well, how fascinating. Well, let's jump into our final question here from the team. And this one's from Kanika, and she's written in, what is a great example you have of inflection leadership?
It's a really interesting one. I would actually say that I'm seeing it with so many of the teams and the clients that I'm working with right now. Now, it's kind of hard because I don't want to share too much information. But I'm seeing leaders responding. I'm working with one leader who has a massive portfolio. Um, and there's a lot happening in very difficult circumstances. And all the time, the work with the leader, that they just keep going back to what is required of me. I could be in a world of overwhelm, but what is required of me now? What are the conversations I need to have? With whom? What is the outcome I'm looking for? Um, where am I spending my time? And actually making sure that despite a massive workload, like 3 times the size of mine or more, that they still carve out time for reflection and strategic thinking. That's that is inflection leadership. And then aligning their team and saying, okay, team, this is what's required of us. What do you think? What matters to you about how you come together, how you deliver? That's the critical thing. How do we then ready the business, which is the third element, restructuring or structuring, how we do meetings, what our operating rhythm is, all of that stuff. But it's done really mindfully in the most extreme circumstances, would be what I would say. So if that sounds, a little bit airy fairy, I'm also, I actually just read something the other day about IKEA, and I thought this was kind of an interesting one, that IKEA introduced chatbots and other AI tools, and they could have retrenched a whole workforce to do with this one area. I think with their customer service. What they did was actually retrain them to be design advisors, design consultants. They opened a new line of work that last count was valued at 1.2 million pounds, I think, for this line of work, as well as keeping all the resources. So that for me is huge inflection leadership because it takes courage to do that, particularly when you have boards, shareholders demanding returns, financial return, really quickly, pull cost out of the business. I think the leaders who um, are actually not pulling cost out of the business as their first port of call, they are the examples of great inflection leadership.
And I think before we get to some final thoughts, let's kind of stay there because because that what you're saying there is going to be sort of controversial for a lot of people to be hearing when we're hearing a lot more about AI. And you're saying that, like, I mean, I love this example. Build on, use it as almost a battery pack to add on to what we've already got, and then you've got this whole new like benefit. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that because that's so fascinating?
Well, look, it's not always possible, and
Mm.
so I'm not suggesting that um, leaders, businesses, become financially irresponsible. But it's pausing before you do that. It's a bit, old school, the pull the cost lever, take the costs out of the business, and suddenly, oh, we've actually destroyed the culture. We can't actually deliver what we need to deliver. And oh, yes, that's right. We're introducing AI, but we're doing it really poorly. We're not um, looking at all our systems and processes and rejigging those. We're just, lifting and shifting so that we can report to a board or to the shareholders that we've made some gains. Um, so I think it's having a mindfulness about who is here, engaging your people in solving the issues. What are we actually solving for here? What are we trying to do? They are often the closest to the customer. They're the closest to what's going on. So where else, what else might be possible? But it takes a lot, to retrain your people and to develop them. But I read somewhere the other day about it was in some study, probably one of the big four. 77% of um, chief human resource officers said that they were concerned about the pipeline of talent that the bench strength that they had to place. And you go, well, if that is true, why is that? Who's being developed? And we know already, speaking of the big four, they've all cut their grad programs because they don't need grads anymore. Oh, okay, but who's going to develop?
Yeah, this is something that we see not only just in the Big Four, but actually it harkens back to a conversation we had with friend of the show, Brent Forrester, who was formerly a writer for The Simpsons, but then went on to become the head writer for The Office in the US. But he was talking about the same things happening in Hollywood with junior producers. So what used to happen with TV shows is you'd have a bunch of people that would be on the show and they'd be junior producers learning under the wing of the producers so that then they would get the opportunity to make their own show. And that's how you get all these different unique shows because you've got people that have the professionalism but have then sort of brought their own flavor to it. And so I guess we're seeing the same thing as well across multiple industries. It seems like this is a sort of a forgotten but obvious place where also I think it also gives us a massive benefit for older people in the business that can be a mentor and help people through a lot of these things where these young people now don't have that connection.
Absolutely, which brings me to another inflection point is our aging population.
Mm.
So the workforce is aging. People are staying in the workforce longer. We know people are doing that. But they don't all necessarily want to do it in the same way. It takes creativity and courage and a bit of risk taking and the desire to actually do something different to say, what else could we do here? And not just one or two people, but like randomly, but actually say, as a way of being, as our culture in this organization, what do we want to do with our population?
Yeah. Wow. Well, what a great conversation. I've just got some final thoughts here because, I mean, I've taken out a bunch of notes, but, about uncertainty and its relationship to control and how much uncertainty is the certainty in some ways. But the big one for me is now I feel like whenever I'm going to see big emotions or things that strike me as odd, my first question has got to be, where do I go when I feel safe, and what is that meaning for how this person's behaving? Because it's
Yeah.
it's their way of feeling safe, what is happening in this situation. So
Mm.
that to me is a really interesting window. Even if it's not true 100% of the time, it's certainly an interesting way to look at the world, and it gives me a different lens.
Yeah, yeah, great. It's that's for me. It comes from the leadership circle, which is a 360 feedback process that I use with 95% of the leaders that I coach. And what I love about it is because it talks about these are our reactive tendencies. We all have them. Depending on how much work we've done on ourselves, sometimes people are better at actually going, I don't need to go there. There is an alternative. I don't need to go into high critical for me to be okay to find fault in others. I could actually just go into high, you know, creative competencies, which are around, high relationship, high collaboration, mentoring and developing rather than finding fault. So it's a beautiful tool um, that actually, again, gives people choice once they're made aware of how they show up.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for that. Did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation?
Oh, it's been a blast. Thank you. I've just loved it. I always feel like I could go, and I think you said in the intro, there's a lot of rabbit holes we could go down. There is so much to cover. And I hope that your listeners and those viewing will actually know that there's opportunity in inflection. If you know where to look and you can bring the curiosity and the creativity and the joy, get feedback on how you're showing up so you've got some data to play with, and then think, what is required of me? That's that's the key to all of this, is that it's not about our personal preference. It's about how do we dial up what's actually required of us right now in these really tricky, changing times.
Well, I think, Chris, you give people at least a way to look at that and see it in a positive light. And I think people will be wanting to not only
Thank
read
you
this
very much.
white paper, but reach out to you. So, do you have what's the best place for them to reach out and read Inflection Leadership, your white paper, and reach out to you?
Uh, Go to my website, which is chrispower.au, or find me on LinkedIn. Um, both very easy to do.
Well, they'll both be in the description, so you can go click those links right now and continue learning from there.
Yeah, I
Beautiful.
want to hear from you. Get
What
in
was
touch.
that's it. Get in touch. Fantastic. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being an amazing guest. Thank you to the team for writing in, and thank you to all the listeners and viewers who've been sharing. If you're not viewing this, you can view it on YouTube and Spotify. So go check that out. That's where we like to have the most fun. We've now got over 20,000 subscribers. We've got over 300 episodes. So there's a lot going on. Go check out the YouTube. But until next time, thank you everybody for sharing. And as always, have a magical week.